I'm Juliette Foster and welcome to Diplomacy in Dialogue, a series of shows in partnership with the German Foreign Office aimed at examining some of the biggest issues facing the international community. Well, our topic today is about battling racism and the crucial role played by diversity, cultural relations and education policy in that fight. And to help us navigate this complex subject, we have assembled an expert panel. Joining us from Berlin is Andreas Gorgen, who's Director of the Department for Culture and Communication at the German Foreign Office. Welcome. And a big welcome too to the award-winning writer, activist and editor, Sharon de Duur Otto. Now, before we begin our discussion, let's examine the subject in a bit more detail. Sadly, racism, right-wing extremism and anti-Semitism are prevalent in all societies. The recent murders in Christchurch, New Zealand and Utøya in Norway are evidence of this, while attacks carried out by members of the neo-Nazi group the NSU show that Germany itself is not immune to these forces. Violence, hatred and abuse are frequently directed at Muslims, Jews, Sinti, Roma and refugees, with almost daily attacks and threats against those engaged in local politics and civil society. Racism remains a clear and present danger for diverse societies which have for decades benefited from migration, and the struggle against structural racism is now a foreign policy commitment, as the German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas emphasised in an article in the online version of the German newspaper Zeit. Well, right-wing extremism, anti-Semitism and all forms of prejudice threaten the core values of German foreign policy, namely human rights, democracy and freedom. Therefore, the German Foreign Office must meet this challenge head-on if its institutions are to gain the trust of both the German public and the wider global community. To this end, a cabinet committee for the fight against racism and right-wing extremism, set up under the leadership of Chancellor Angela Merkel at the beginning of 2020, drafted a catalogue of 89 specific measures aimed at confronting the challenges from both an international and cultural perspective. Well, with its cultural relations and education policy, the Federal Foreign Office facilitates access to culture and education beyond geographical, social and political borders, while bringing people around the world into contact with each other and promoting mutual understanding. Crucially, it forms the third pillar of German foreign policy, alongside political and economic relations. It tries to operate as a tool for bringing together actors from civil society, advocating the freedom of the arts and sciences around the world, cultivating spaces for the critical exchange of ideas and freedom of expression, as well as protecting cultural property as symbols of cultural identity. Foreign cultural and educational policy puts human rights, diversity, democracy, education and freedom at the very heart of its policy process. Well, today's discussion will explore the effects of right-wing extremism, structural racism and anti-Semitism on our societies and on transnational civil society exchanges. How can societies characterised by diversity counter racist threats and structures? What role does cross-border cooperation play in this context? How can art and culture contribute? And what support do they need from politics? Well, we'll hear about the core beliefs that will guide policy making and find out about the steps being taken to ensure diversity and democracy are promoted at all levels of operations. We'll also ask how success will be measured and the type of society that could emerge over the next decade. OK, so there is plenty to talk about, but let's start first with that recent quote I referenced from the Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, which appeared in Zeit online. He said, "The struggle against structural racism is also a foreign policy task. However, that can only work if this image is in accord with the reality in Germany. And there remains much to do if, even 20 years after the first NSU murder, people with foreign roots in Germany feel that not everyone is treated the same way here, whether it be when looking for somewhere to live, in a job interview or at an appointment with the authorities. When they go to the police, their migrant background is recorded." Andreas Gorgen, as the German Foreign Minister has stated, racism remains a clear danger for diverse society. So given that, how do you think the issue is perceived in Germany and what do you regard as the major challenges?
Thank you, Juliette, for your question. let me resume just one point, which is of utmost importance in what the minister said. Racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia is putting our own values on threat. So the most important point I want to raise is that racism has to be brought in accord with our reality. The fight against racism has to be brought into accord with our society, and our society has to be put on a next level on evolution. And to reach that aim, the government has taken four points. The first point is to raise awareness and improve state structures. Then the most important, perhaps, is to recognize and value a diverse society that ensures equal opportunities for all. And the third point was to extend the support for victims. And the fourth is to work on prevention. So those 4 points are declined into nearly 100 different measures, and some measures are specific for what we are doing, so for the work for the international cultural policies. And I just want to name 2 measures we will take in the upcoming month. The first is to have a look on our own structures and on our own prejudice. So we will do an extensive screening of our structures in foreign cultural and education policy and an analysis where we come from and where we want to go with regard to that issue, to the fight against racism and right-wing extremism. And then the second point I want to outline is that we have to take actions in our schools with our civil society organizations we are working with to reach out to something which goes beyond national state and an understanding of how diversity can ensure progress for the 21st century.
Okay, so you've outlined the methodology, what you're going to do to fight it, but at the same time, you've got to look at the organic impact that racism, extremism and anti-Semitism is having on our societies. I mean, how would you describe that? And more specifically, what is the impact that racism is having within Germany's DNA?
Sorry, I didn't get your question.
Okay, I'll repeat the question. You've outlined the methodologies that you plan to use to combat extremism, etc. But at the same time, what is the organic effect of racism, extremism and anti-Semitism on societies and on transnational society? What is it doing within the DNA of these societies and in German society in particular?
Okay. Let me try to resume your question on 2 points. The first point is, where do you come from? So we come from an idea of a homogenic national state. And with regard to the German culture, we come from an idea in the end of 18th, 19th century that Germany is a nation built on culture. But still, there is an idea of a homogeneous community, and that homogeneity has to be reflected in culture. And now we go to a society which is much more diverse, and where the contradiction of communities living within a national state has to be brought in accordance in what I would call a general interest. And the second is referring to the society we are living in. There are structures of inequality. There are structures of a mindset which is not based, but which is influenced on racist structures. So this is the work we have to do within our own society. Value diversity and work through the structures which enhance inequality and reflect injustice.
Okay, Sharon, let me bring you into the conversation because, look, you're a woman of colour who lives and works in Germany. So do you believe that to a very large extent, perhaps, the country has been in denial about how widespread and pernicious racism is, and more specifically, the impact that it's actually having within the soul of the country?
Yes, unfortunately, I would have to say there has been an element of denial. That's to do with, I think, the real fear of using the term racism in the German context. I think it's moved along now, the debate, a little bit. We've seen, for example, with the events that happened in summer this year, when George Floyd was murdered and the Black Lives Matter movement was more prominent for many countries around the world. We've seen the conversation around the subject of racism and discrimination has become more in the public sphere, but there is still a feeling, I think, if you would speak to the average person on the street, I think they would still not have a real understanding of what racism is and how much racism really affects everybody who lives in Germany.
Okay, so given that, why is now the right time for Germany to have the diversity conversation? Because as Andreas pointed out, yes, there has been a journey which has been going on, but I guess the argument is, shouldn't we have actually caught the wave on this a bit sooner? Why now?
This is a very good question. I think the reason why we should do it now is, if not now, then when? And it's not from lack of trying on the part of various communities, black communities in Germany, but also we've been speaking about the Jewish communities, Sinti and Roma communities. There have been efforts over centuries and definitely over decades to try and get this on the agenda. And as I said, this summer, I think in combination with the real crisis that's going on around COVID-19 and the pandemic, there's been now a focus on inequalities and discrimination and what the impacts of these very long-standing structural inequalities have had, for example, on the health service, to show that people really are suffering from differential access to these services, and what can we do to change that? What can we do about that? These conversations are now being had. They're now being, I would say, heard, because people have always been saying these things. And why wait till tomorrow? Why wait till somebody else is murdered? We should start straight away.
Yeah, I mean, let's run with this idea, Andreas, because look, clearly, the German government has been receptive to this conversation, because you've had a cabinet committee which has been discussing this whole issue. But I mean, what really brought it on? Was it the combination of the fallout from George Floyd's death and, of course, the conversations triggered by COVID-19? Or was there something that was happening that perhaps preceded all of that?
Well, there's one point which is of utmost importance for that issue, and that is the Bandung conferences. So the decolonization starts with Bandung, and the search for a universal community is starting there. So it's a long-lasting debate. It's a long-lasting debate also in the United Nations and after on in the UNESCO. And this comes to a kind of culmination in this culminating point in this summer with Floyd. With COVID, because COVID learns us that we are as human beings, we are vulnerable, and societies are vulnerable. And then it comes to the point that we get aware of more points of inequality, of those who are working in the health service, those who assume that a society can continue to live in a equal and a just way, are those who are not at the top of the social structures in a society. So I would totally agree. There is a long-lasting discussion lasting for 70 years. And then it comes to a culminating point in this summer, also with on talking about cultural affairs, with the report of Felwine Sarr and Benedict Savoy of the reconstitution of cultural objects to the former colonized countries. So all this is culminating in that new sensibility in the society. So this is perhaps the reason why this question pops up in this summer and winter.
Okay then, but look, we've got the conversation, the talking is happening at government level, but what emerges from that? It's great to have this talk, but what is it that's going to be tangible, something which people can relate to, that really takes things on, it moves it forward?
Well, it's not just talking. It's taking concrete measures, 89 measures, and spending roughly 1.5 billion euros a year. And in addition to what has been done, additional 150 million euros. So these are concrete measures in enforcing the structures who deal with racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. Second is to do trainings have a diversity strategy in the administration. So we will have develop a diversity strategy for our own business, and other ministries are doing same. There is an enforcement of prevention and of the fight against the extreme right. And there's a large prevention work within the police. So these are concrete measures.
Okay, so it's really putting the money where the mouth is, effectively, so it actually shores up what is happening. But Sharon, let me bring you into the conversation. Is this an approach that you approve of? Is it radical enough, or is it perhaps a bit too cautious?
Well, I have to admit that I haven't read the 89 measures. What I've done is I've spoken a little bit to other community activists who have been more involved, working through the measures and in consultation with the German government. And I'm aware that there are groups, for example, Sylvie Nanscher of the African Network of Germany is very happy with the measures that have been proposed in the paper. But I'm also aware of other groups, for example, Türkische Gemeinde in Deutschland, which is a Turkish community in Germany, or a black community organisation called Each One Teach One. They've been much more critical because they've said, yes, there are measures, but they're not concrete enough, they're not attached to real numbers. And I think this can only be seen as something like a beginning of a process that's going to take some time, and it's going to maybe need more arguments, more constructive dialogue to really get to the bottom. Because if we're going to change structural racism in Germany, then at some point there's going to be, structures will have to be broken, and this will just need a lot of effort on all parts.
Sure. Let me bring Andreas into the conversation, because look, you've heard that. So, what is your response to that? That it seems that yes, there are some quarters where the approach you're taking has been welcomed, but others who feel that perhaps it doesn't go far enough. So perhaps you're a bit too cautious.
Well, that's perhaps a intrinsic issue of democracy. So any measure you take in order to ensure the progress of a whole society might not be sufficient with regard to 1 or 2 or 10 communities. Because at one level, and this is clearly the governmental level, you have to coordinate and to bring together conflicting interests. So for sure, any measure taken by a government is not sufficient with regard to a special interest of one community or a group within a society. But let me just underline that measures taken by a government are not the only way to push a society forward. There are different levels and structures. So there is a lot of work done on the level of the communalities, of the cities in Germany, and of the federal states. And there's a lot to be done, and there is a lot done within the civil society. Sharon O'Toole just mentioned Each One Teach One. So this is clearly also for us an important partner in our way to reflect upon our policies. And this is a civil society organization which has gained importance, and this importance will move policies forward. So sorry to say again, it's never sufficient what you do in order to try to coordinate a common interest which is based on a cohesion of a society, but it is a way forward. And I think the important thing is that this society has decided to go forward and to tackle that issue of racism.
Okay, Sharon, look, you're in a unique position here because you've got links with both the United Kingdom and Germany, so you can see things from both sides of the fence in that regard. But do you think that the German government is perhaps a bit more honest in terms of how it's confronting extremism and anti-Semitism compared to the authorities in Britain? Because clearly for Germany, this is a very painful and difficult journey, but there is a sense that it is one that has to be done. There is a moral imperative underscoring this.
Definitely there is, and I totally agree with what Andreas Gergen has just said, and I'm very glad that I'm not in the government, not having to balance all these interests. But as an activist, I would say, yes, I make no apologies for saying if we're going to really get to the bottom of dealing with structural racism, there will be other people who will be upset about that. Those people, we talked a bit about in the beginning that Germany has conceived of itself as a homogenous national state and the role of culture in that. And so culture will then, I know we'll talk about this a bit later, but culture will then play a role in breaking up this idea that Germany is so homogenous. And that will upset some people, but they say you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. And then the comparison with the UK, I find that a very interesting question because I'm often asked whether I find, say, the German context more racist than the British context. And I normally say I don't like to compare in that way because I think that the cultural history, what has happened in the past in both contexts lead to specific cultures of today and specific movements, specific communities that have moved to the UK, specific communities that have moved to Germany mean that there's a different cultural mix and a different makeup of how discrimination functions in each society. I would say I feel like the discourse around racism is perhaps at a different level in the UK and in the US. There is I have an access to a specific vocabulary where I can use, for example, words like race, and it's pretty much understood that's referring to a social construct, whereas in German, the language has been, say, influenced by this Nazi past where the German word for race, Rasse, doesn't quite have the same connotation. I like that in Germany, I have the feeling that, especially within Berlin and in the context here where I have a lot of access to other active politically active groups, and I feel there's a lot going on in this context. I didn't have that access when I was living in London, so again, it's difficult for me to compare. But I do know, for example, that in the UK, there is a way of being able to count specific communities because we do ethnic monitoring in the UK. So, for example, it's possible to measure that stop and search disproportionately affects young black men in London. We don't have access to those kinds of figures in the German context. Again, due to the specific German past, it's seen as a taboo to try and collect data of that kind. But I wonder how effective any measures can be that the German government is taking if we don't have access to figures and numbers to show how well or how poorly specific measures are being taken.
OK, it's an interesting point and one that I hope to address certainly later in the debate. But let's break off from our panel for just one moment because now we want to get the view of the general public. Now, we asked a random selection of people the following question, which was, how does racism affect your society and Europe at large? How does racism affect your society and Europe at large? Let's hear their response.
I think racism affects society in a negative way. It makes people not want to live in different countries and it can make people aggressive towards each other.
The racism in Europe is not as clear than in US and it's not something that you can that is very visible, you know.
Racism affects society because it's just everywhere. And it's still here, it's ongoing, and we're fighting it, and there's more and more stuff happening, but it's still here, and it's a problem, and we have to overcome it.
I think firstly, I think it's very important from the, the government, top of the government or society, say something to the society, to the people. I think that this initiative is the most important.
I think that racism impacts our society because I don't especially see it as cool, but in the street or something, sometimes when I'm at the bar or something, like I see dark-skinned people get insulted by other basically other people.
I think that the racism impacts society in the lack of equality to all the people that suffers this plague that we are living in our days.
I think racism affects society which makes people of other race feel less secure and less comfortable of living in a society. To my own experience, I live in Belgium. Open racism is not common. I've never encountered any very serious offense to me. But sometimes it's more about this more minor offense. And when you are more psychologically feeling secure, these things doesn't have a negative impact, but we will have the time that we have a bad day. So when these small things add up, yeah, it is something that bothers me.
The thoughts there of the general public. Quite a few points coming out there, Sharon. Obviously, the acknowledgement that racism exists, the fact that it makes people feel insecure, less welcome. But one of the key points which certainly stood out there was how racism presents itself. We had one of the Vox Poppers saying that in Europe, racism is more subtle, unlike the United States, where it is more explicit. So, from your experience, is the distinction really as simple as that? In other words, the racism which is more in your face, at least you know where you stand, as opposed to the racism which is a bit more subtle, which plays tricks on the mind?
Oh, I don't know if I can really say one is better than the other. Of course, I'm glad that I don't live in a society where I have a real fear of gun violence. But then again, having said that, there was, of course, the shooting in Hanau in February this year. There was the shooting in October last year in Halle. It feels to me like there's a continuation, and I don't like to think about worse forms of racism and easier going forms of racism. I like to think of racism as a continuum where it's important at every stage to try our very best to stop it. So my area of expertise is language. I'm a creative writer, so I look very closely at the writing that I'm producing, and I try very hard not to reproduce stereotypes. I look very carefully at the kind of language I'm using, because I know that language has a real effect on what people think, and how people think can influence their actions, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting point as well, Andreas, because look, the bottom line is just looking at that cross-section of views. It really gives you a sense of the scale and complexity of the problem that you're taking on, and the danger, perhaps, of actually breaking racism down into those very simplistic terms that it's easier to deal with if it's very explicit, more complicated if it's hidden.
Yeah, and there are two levels of a responsibility within a government. One level is dealing with accountability and being responsible. So that's referring to the lack of numbers. Sharon put it out. That's referring to the measurement of the actions taken. And there is a second layer, which is of importance for society. This is what has been mentioned by one of the fellows you interviewed, is to feel secured, to feel welcomed. And this is beyond measurement. This is about the atmosphere, about an energy a society is creating and people are living within a society. So this is a second layer of policy and of the actions to be taken by politics. How you create a society in which everyone genuinely feels they belong and they have an open future and can create a common future.
Yeah, I mean, let's pick up on that point of the lack of numbers, because certainly Sharon referenced it in the first part of the discussion, the fact that perhaps a model to gauge community numbers, to actually gauge responses, it's not really there as such, and perhaps because of that you don't get an honest representation of the real problems that communities are encountering. Is that something that worries you? This is the question to Andreas.
Well, it doesn't, it worries me as a citizen, and I do not know. I'm not specialist in politics in the UK, so I do not know which measures are taken in the UK and what are your numbers. But it's clear, and that was a point I mentioned in the early beginning. It's very clear that we have to focus, to do a screening of our own measures we are doing within the cultural policies, in the framework of the fight against racism and anti-Semitism. And we do not have the numbers which give us a clear answer if we are taking the right actions. So let me limit it, right, my answer to that point. I need more clear numbers of the structures within I'm working and our society is working in order to address those issues.
Yeah, and how do you get that? How do you sell it to the public? Because the reality is that you're going to meet hostility.
I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. I still believe that there is a European tradition called enlightenment. So from the moment on, you get a discourse to a kind of rationality that you find you find answers. So one of those measures, of the 89 measures taken by the government, is just to enforce and to enhance the research about racism. And we are working with that institution, which is called DECIM for our own, and I'm quite optimistic that we'll get something out. And second, I do not believe, even if we tackle challenges, I do not believe that tackling and naming the challenges will create disturbances. I think for society it's much more dangerous a silent disaccord and to put threats under silence.
Okay, then let me bring in another quote from Heiko Maas, again from that same article in Zeit Online. And this is what he said. He said, there is structural racism in our country, even though we have long since become this colourful and diverse country, which some reject so vehemently. However, if we do not succeed in creating a society in which everyone genuinely feels they belong, our society's guiding principle will be nothing more than an empty shell. So Sharon, that's a pretty powerful statement, but it comes back to the heart of what needs to be done, not just to combat racism, but also to bring the public on board so that they can actually embrace the potential that diversity brings, because societies have been enriched by diversity.
Yes, for sure. And also I'd like to also throw in another thought that I've been having is diversity is not only about so-called migration background or about race. It's also about sexuality. It's also about gender. It's also about disability or age. And that's why I always claim that Germany has never been a homogenous society. That's a myth that has been, we've been telling ourselves. I say we because I also live here and I'm also now a German. And it's something that we do to try and gain a sense of security, that if everyone's the same, then somehow we'll all get along better or something like that. And what I would like to imagine in my literature and in my activism is a society that feels comfortable with difference, and a society that says, yeah, we have different triggers, we have different talents, we have different traumas, and yet we all share this patch of land that we're living on. How can we do the best that we can all together?
Okay, so it's the idea of being comfortable with difference. And Andreas, how does that link to a phrase with which you're synonymous, and that is openness to the world? What does that phrase actually mean? And how should it work in reality?
Well, I think that's exactly the task of cultural policies. So first of all, diversity is the fuel of democracy. If you do not have a contradiction in a society, democracy cannot work. And what we have to learn, or what we have to acknowledge, is that diversity in our own culture is also the fuel of progress and of beauty. So first point is we have to develop an aesthetics of diversity. And I'm not only talking about racism, I'm also talking about LGBT structures. And when you have a look on the cultural responsibilities in Germany, in the cultural organizations, we have a lack of diversity. There are only, I think, only 3 to 4 directors of theaters in Germany coming from a diverse community. So there is much to be done. And second is, so a diversity strategy for our own structure. Second is to develop a aesthetics of diversity, and that this reflects beauty much more than the pretension of a homogeneity. And the third element is create cultural infrastructure, because if we will have to train ourselves in the field of arts and culture to deal with diversity and to accept the different dreams and different traumata in the protected field of arts, culture, and science, and then go out with that learning and change a society. So for me, the fourth point is the importance of cultural and educational infrastructures where people can learn how to deal with diversity and how to develop the first mentioned point, so aesthetic of diversity and an understanding that even democracy is not working if you do not have differences and diversities.
Let me stay with that phrase, the aesthetics of diversity, Sharon, because whenever we look at the race question, invariably you're going to get generations being brought into this. But do you feel that the actual concept, as Andreas has explained it, about the aesthetics of diversity, that perhaps more young people are willing to embrace it perhaps than older people to whom it might be a little bit alien, a little bit esoteric? Is there a generational divide that needs to be bridged on this?
Again, I keep on sitting on the fence, but I'm reluctant to say yes, the older generation has more of a problem than the younger generation. I could imagine that there are things that the older generation has been used to, more used to using certain languages that are today considered to be inappropriate, for example. But just as I always feel uncomfortable when there's a thing in Germany sometimes where we talk about how the East is perhaps more racist than the West, or I don't know, men more than women, I don't know. I feel uncomfortable at doing those things. I think I'd like to think more about the different chances and opportunities we have to reach the different generations. So, for example, I think what the younger generation does have is an access to, say, great access to social media and engaging with each other via social media in more numbers than the older generation does. So this means perhaps aesthetically they are more used to diversity. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't still have certain stereotypes. They're also engage in problematic behavior, for example, just to throw out one term, digital blackface. So we still have to think about what exactly is racism. And here I would specifically say anti-Black racism. How does it look? How does it function? What is its effect on Black people? And this education has to be done all through all different generations, because it functions in different ways across different societal groups.
Okay, but Andreas, let me bring you into this, because at the end of the day, when we talk about racism and diversity, by nature, they are very controversial topics. And I guess that the worry for you is groups like the AfD. I mean, how can you stop them actually turning that conversation, poisoning it, and actually turning it into a political issue so that the integrity of what it is that you're trying to achieve is lost, because it then becomes a fight between the rights of one group against those of another?
Well, first of all, and this is part of my answer as a citizen, vote. Go vote. Be part of a democracy. That's the citizen answer. Second is, don't forget where we come from. After 1945, we came from a Nazi society. We come from an anti-Semitic society. So the first issue for Germany was the fight against anti-Semitism, and to educate ourselves and to reform our own sense of belonging. So if the fight against racism is in the same a fight against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So to answer your question is, what we can do is not only to recognize what's not going well in our country, but to open ways, to pathways to a joyful future in that diversity. And this is, so the fight against racism and the far right is in the same time an endeavor to path a joyful way to a common future.
Sharon, let's close this part of the discussion by really getting you to address this point, because look, Germany is forging its anti-racism strategy, and it's to be congratulated on that. But I guess the danger has to be not just from within the AfD, but it's also the culture of strongman politics that's being played out in parts of Europe, like Hungary and Poland, for example, and also in other parts of the world. And isn't that the biggest threat? Because if you're a cynic, you would say that however well-intentioned things are, those desires are usually curbed by the realities at home and on the doorstep, strongman and national identity politics.
Yeah, I just have to agree with that. It's very concerning to me to see specific strongman figures that have arisen in the past few years across Europe and also in the United States. Okay, so there's a glimmer of hope now that Joe Biden is to be the new president, touch wood. I don't know, I think I can only agree with Andreas here and say that it's important for us citizens also to take our role, take our place, use our different possibilities. So use our votes, but also to engage with civil society. There's different activist groups in Germany. I'm involved with the initiative Black People in Germany, which has existed for close to 40 years. Its sister group, ADEFRA, which is a queer feminist organization that has been around about the same time. I'm also involved with Phoenix, which is an organization that works with people on both sides of the experience of racism, those who benefit from it and those who are negatively affected by it, and trying to engage in conversations and to try to come to an understanding about how things can improve. And we've got to work in all our different spheres. It's great if people get involved at school, become parent representatives. It's great if they get involved in unions, and to try to make an effect in all these areas. I don't really have a better answer than that.
OK then, well, let's move the debate on, because structural racism is a term that has frequently come up in the debate. So let's explore it. What in fact does it actually mean? Well, we've spoken to 4 representatives from the Diplomats of Colour network at the German Foreign Ministry, and they've given us their thoughts on systemic racism. Here is what they had to say.
I want our civil service to represent the diverse reality of our society. Why do people ask me, so you're a German diplomat? Really? Why don't you look German? Well, guess what? I do look German because I am. Structural racism manifests itself in different ways. The term migration background refers to a person who has at least one parent without German citizenship. Sorry, my white neighbor has a French mom, but has never experienced racist discrimination. But I have, and I do, every day.
Democracy depends on representation. German society nowadays does not look the same it did 50 years ago. Public institutions need legitimization, especially in times when populists and extremists everywhere question democratic principles. So for me, it's clear. We need an international, preferably multilateral group of allies to tackle racism, at home and internationally.
Discrimination is also a reality at work. Just as an example, at an official function, I was confused with catering staff and advised to take another entrance. And we have heard many similar stories from colleagues of color when we collected them for the diversity issue of our staff magazine. Unlike the UK or Canada, Germany still has no people of color representing the country abroad as an ambassador or consul general. Institutional racism often boils down to who is perceived to belong and who's not. Overcoming that is one of the toughest challenges we face on our way to achieving equity and representation for people of color.
The motto of the European Union is unity in diversity. And that is exactly what we need in international cooperation, to fight racism, other forms of discrimination, and to strengthen the democratic foundation of our pluralist society. That's why we join hands at Diplomats of Color, DOC, the POC initiative at the Federal Foreign Office, and the only one in the federal administration so far.
An interesting range of views there expressed by diplomats of colour. Andreas, can Germany combat structural racism when, as we've heard, you've got up-and-coming diplomats who go to official events and rather than being greeted as equals, they're treated as members of the catering staff?
Well, first of all, let me say I take pride in seeing those colleagues. And together, you know, the measures we developed for the decision of the German government were developed in partly together with them. So their input was of tremendous importance for us. And I'm really taking pride in seeing those younger colleagues working within the foreign ministry and representing Germany. So this is my first point. Yeah, we can combat structural racism. We have to show that we are proud of our own diversity. It's also a kind of symbolic policies, is showing up the diversity and showing up those who really embody that diversity. That's the first point. Second is educate our own people. A question, where do you come from? And if somebody answers, I'm coming from Berlin or I'm coming from Reutlingen, then comes a second question, which is narrowing down that racist issue. And this is, where do you really come from? So we have to educate our people. These questions are not admissible in an equal society. And the third way to combat structural racism is create spaces for the civil society, but also create spaces within arts, culture, and science, where you can work on these issues and where you can experience those issues without putting them on a political threat immediately.
Okay, Sharon, look, I mean, the point that's emerged from this is that structural racism, or institutional racism as we would call it in the United Kingdom, it is clearly very entrenched. Okay, we've got the sense of that from those 4 contributions, but it's not just there within the civil service. It goes beyond that, doesn't it, at a municipal level, but also in the police. And that's quite important, because if the police is to be successful at what it does, it needs to win the trust of communities. And how can it do that if the perception in some of these communities is that it is institutionally racist?
Yes, the question of trust is very important. I'd like to mention at this point that there have been some tragedies which have still not been explained adequately. They've been investigated, but the answers that have come up have been inadequate. In 2005, a man called Uri Jallo he died under mysterious circumstances. Actually, it's well known that he was murdered by the police in a police cell in Dessau. And since then, there's been an annual demonstration every January in Dessau where people are asking what happened to Uri Jallo. There's been countless television documentaries, newspaper articles about this. There's been many attempts to try and get justice for Uri Jallo, and this has failed. And so in order to really address the question of structural racism in the police, we have to look at justice. We really have to find out what happens. It's not only Uri Jallo, for example, there was also Christi Schwundeck, a woman who was killed by a police officer in 2013 in Frankfurt. Mariam Assar was killed by a police officer in 2001. There are countless examples, and the common thread, which seems to be common in many countries, in the UK and the US, for example, also is that these deaths go, no one is found responsible for them, no one is brought to justice. And so in order to regain trust in the German authorities and the German police, we need to really not only look at diversity, but also to look at trust and to look at justice.
Yeah, and let's follow that through, Andreas, because I guess you could argue that as long as there is no accountability, there is no trust, and that basically holds back what it is that you are trying to do.
Sorry, would you repeat the question? Didn't get it.
Of course. The point that I was getting at is that there are concerns about cases where the police are seen to have actually failed in terms of getting to the root of what caused the incidents. And as long as there is no accountability, you will not have any trust. And that means that from your strategy, it's going to hold it back. It's going to undermine whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, because the trust is simply missing along with the accountability.
Well, firstly, trust has to be built. And if there's a doubt, it has to be investigated. And I think this is what's going on. Secondly, there is a feeling of belonging which goes beyond legal issues. So if people answer, I do not feel welcomed in a society, then the society has to work on that question. Because you're German from the moment on you have a German passport. It's a very easy and simple answer. There is no other definition to it. But this does not, if the structures are not adopted to that. So if you have that kind of exclusive thinking which is linked to a certain sense of understanding what might be culture, then we have to work on that very notion, what is our culture? And we have to make clear that our culture is not a exclusive culture based on whatever that might be, on ethnic, on LGBT, on language issues, but that our culture is open to the world and open to those people coming to Germany and choosing Germany as a citizen and as their place where they want to develop a common future.
Sharon, this is all happening, as I stated earlier, against a really turbulent backdrop, not just in Germany, but around the world. We've had the fallout from the George Floyd killing, but also the Black Lives Matter movement. The voice is being heard. Do you believe that as long as Black Lives Matter actually has its spark, so to speak, then the whole issue about racism and diversity will stand at the top of Germany's political agenda?
I think that it was extremely important that the Black Lives Matter movement was finally taken seriously, I would say, finally got the media attention it deserved. Black Lives Matter has been a collection of people within Germany for many years. It didn't just start this summer. So for that reason, I'm also slightly skeptical that this will be the step that has, that will suddenly change everything. I believe that it's important that the German government is taking the steps it has taken. From my perspective, my heart bleeds a little that again, and this is not only in the German context, but we've seen it in many other contexts, it's taken someone to die before a group of people have come together and said, okay, we've got to take right-wing extremism seriously, we've got to take racism seriously, we've got to take anti-Semitism seriously. My wish is that we keep this on the agenda and increase the focus on it and increase the importance of educating the general public about how important this is, because I'm not sure that the level of interest that apparently is being taken in the German government is shared across the general population. I'm not so sure about that. The reason I say that is because there was recently a report in the UK, actually, which people were asked what they thought about Black Lives Matter, and many people, like a greater percentage of the respondents were saying that Black Lives Matter has exacerbated the racist tensions. And I know that within the German context, there have been some debates around, for example, cancel culture, which I experience as just a simple, very healthy reaction when a comedian or a writer, public figure says something problematic, that they get feedback if what they said is considered to be racist or otherwise offensive. But this has led to a counter movement of others claiming that they're being cancelled and unfairly cancelled and political correctness has gone mad and all the rest of it. So I'm not sure that we are on the same page about about the importance of having this conversation about racism. But I am happy that it's happening, and I hope it continues, and that the importance of it does not abate just because apparently everything seems to be fine. Because marginalized communities will always say, no, there is still a problem. Even if it seems that everything's fine, the marginalized communities are the ones who are feeling the pain, and who can definitely say, no, we still need to keep the focus on it.
Okay, let me bring Andreas back into the conversation, because I'd like you to respond, if you may, to a Twitter question which came through from one of our viewers. The question is, diversity should begin in one's own ranks. How diverse is the foreign ministry? Andreas.
Not diverse enough.
In a nutshell, why is it not diverse enough? How diverse does it need to be credible?
Putting it in a number?
If you feel comfortable with that, or if you just wish to reference it generally?
Well, I think there are several key performance indicators you could take. First is, does the social structure of a foreign ministry reflect the own population? And this is referring to all in brackets minorities, so to all societal groups, LGBT groups, groups with another ethnic background, all that kind of stuff. That might be a first approach. Second approach is on a more symbolic question: how many people with a diverse background are in power in those bureaucratic structures? And a third question might be, who is representing Germany abroad? So it might be of utmost importance of showing our small, diverse group outside of Germany, and in the same time, you might reflect upon how do you change a public service, and you change it within the public service. So it might be more important to have than here in Berlin. So this is not the answer. It's just saying it's not diverse enough, and then you can work on several layers.
Absolutely, which is the approach that you are taking. And look, I want to end this debate with a final question that I'd like to put to both of you. And it's really designed, I guess, to also broaden horizons by looking to the future. And in a nutshell, it is this. Could either one of you tell us, why is this topic so important to you personally? Can I start first with then Sharon, and then have Andreas give me his response to that? Why is this topic so important to you personally?
This topic of discussing racism is something I've done my whole life. It began as a child. I realized that there was a kind of certain feeling of not belonging and not being able to put my finger on it. I was fortunate enough to not be, at least it didn't happen very often, that I was called names or physically attacked. But that isn't what I'm talking about when I say I experienced racism as a child. I grew up with certain people had certain expectations of me, actually lower expectations of me. I was kind of stereotyped and pushed into certain corners in terms of what career options I was offered and such. And this feeling of being alienated continued throughout my life. I moved to Germany partly because I felt like, okay, although I was born and raised in London, I don't feel 100% as if I belong there. Let me go somewhere else, and then I really don't belong there, and then somehow that feels much more comfortable again. But at the same time, I'm a mother now, and I don't want my children to have that exact same feeling that I had. Racism is a subject in the way that I raise my children, in the conversations I have with their school teachers, in the conversations that my children have with their friends, unfortunately, still to today. And I don't see this as going away anytime soon. I think that's the thing that maybe people who experience racism have as a common experience that's different from those who don't experience racism on their own bodies, that we don't think that racism is going to just disappear because of another diversity initiative or because of some new case. Racism is here for a long time. We're going to have to learn how to live with it, but we're also going to have to learn how to transform it. And this will take some time, but I think we can do it. We can take those steps, and we can take courage in those steps and pass on the strategies to the next generation so that they can continue the work. And that's why I really, I'm very passionate about anti-racism work. And I try to see myself as an active person in that. So in my sphere of influence, which is literature, I do what I can. And if everybody does their bit within their spheres of influence, then together we'll make a difference.
Okay, and Andreas.
I want to raise two elements. First element is a bit personal. I think to make its way through the institutions in a society and to change a society is a fierce fight. I come from a background where I didn't know what is a diplomat, and I couldn't dream of becoming a diplomat. And that's for many people, and that's something I think everybody has a sensibility for. It is a fight to be fought in a society, to change it, and to have a stand, to have a saying in the society. So this is the more personal point. And I want to encourage people and to empower the younger generation to change that society, because progress is change. Progress is not conserving something. And the second is related to my understanding what is German culture. And just to give you an idea, of how German culture is not only linked to that homogeneity thinking. When Thomas Sankara in the 80s made his speech before the United Nations, he referred to Novalis, to the core of German culture. And he quoted Novalis saying, so our history will be the dream of the present extended to infinity. And this is something I think German culture can bring into that concert of diversity. There is something going beyond national states, something going beyond a government, and which is belonging to a sense of universality. Sorry, a sense of universal.
Okay, and that is a sound note, in fact, on which to end this discussion. And that is it from us. I'd like to extend a very big thank you to my guests, Andreas Gorgon and Sharon Dodua Otto. We'll see you again very, very soon on the next Diplomacy in Dialogue. Stay safe and goodbye.